We're going to continue our coverage of the East African budget, the Tanzanian budget announcement currently underway. And according to the Minister for Finance, Tanzania's priorities in 2013-14 are to increase availability for electricity, transport infrastructure, strengthening information and communication technology. Well, to focus now on Tanzania, I'm joined in studio by Neema Rankalwana Bana, who is Global Markets Researcher at Rand Merchant Bank. Hi there, Neema. I get some tough names in the studio, but yours defeated me there.
Real tongue twister.
Yes, just you say to me how I should have said it?
Neema Rankalwana Bana.
There we are, very good. Now they know who you are. You heard what Mahmoud there was talking about with Tanzania, and perhaps I could put the question to you as well, if I could put it in the way of saying the integrity of a budget. It's great to have all the paraphernalia and the speeches and so on, but is there credibility to the Tanzanian budget? I'm not saying there isn't, but what is the level?
Generally, when you look at budgets, you want to see whether it's aligned to longer term plans. If you have to assess the budget, and unfortunately we don't have the same level of detail that we would on Uganda or Kenya, we have to compare as to whether or not it is aligned to the National Development Plan and whether or not there is clarity over capital execution and implementation of the budget. I think in certain areas, particularly with regards to development expenditure in Tanzania and probably the East African region as a whole, there has been certain gaps in the implementation and the absorption, particularly of donor aid, which is ring-fenced for infrastructure projects. So it remains to be seen, I think, within the next 12 months as to whether they can carry through on these plans.
Looking at the infrastructure issue, I think it's an issue throughout Africa. People in South Africa used to say, well, it's not for us, but it is. It's everywhere. So to what extent are these great growth plans and the African growth story? I mean, I've got a document here talking about GDP growth in Tanzania being over 7%. Kenya's looking at 6% to 7% next year and the year after. These are big numbers. How can they grow that much if the issues around infrastructure are so serious?
Well, to put it into context, Africa as a whole, sub-Saharan Africa, let's take that as a region, expected to grow between 5 and 5.5% over the next 5 years. Compare that to Tanzania's forecasted growth rates. Over a medium term, we're looking anywhere between 7.3 and 8%. Now, that's largely underpinned by production growth. And when I say that, we're looking at agriculture, services, and industry. We understand that agriculture continues to be the lifeblood of the economy in Tanzania, but we haven't seen the necessary government spending to support an increase in productivity necessarily. As I say, we need to see that concomitant spending, particularly the movement from subsistence to commercialized farming. When looking at industry and services, we've seen quite a bit of interest in East Africa and Tanzania as a whole because of the hydrocarbon reserves and the potential that may lie there. Now, that is a longer term prospect, 2018-2019. Yes, there is going to be great economic benefit from that, which could propel growth rates in excess of 10%. We've seen that in prior cases. Let's not forget Ghana 2 years ago. But what we have to keep in mind is that initial capital outlay that government needs to invest in infrastructure, in the surrounding sectors, but also in other sectors. There needs to be necessary economic diversification. I think where Africa trails behind other emerging markets is that we're still very much narrow-minded in terms of our exposures. It's a resource base in many countries. Kenya, I think, is still the leader in terms of East Africa because of its economic diversification. And I think that's something that Tanzania is aspiring to.
In fact, Kenya is diversifying the other way around, isn't it? It's looking at exploration for oil, whereas most countries have done it the other way around. Just looking at Tanzania, in fact, the whole East African bloc, but Tanzania in particular, as it's your expertise, tax collection. In South Africa, unfortunately for a lot of us, tax collection is world class. I mean, we're among the best in the world in terms of our tax collection authority, and they're very efficient indeed. What about the point made by Mahmoud that the few companies that do comply, that are registered, and I suppose are so visible that they can't avoid being taxed, that too much burden on them and not enough of that spread?
Well, tax revenue in East Africa and particularly in Tanzania is your bulk of your revenues that are accruing to your government that needs to come into your coffers in order to finance your expenditure. And for many years now, we've experienced this revenue shortfall. And I think that's more so on the part of individual tax collections rather than corporate tax collections. It's perhaps because individual tax collection has not been as sophisticated as in other countries, for example, the tax base hasn't been widened efficiently enough. Non-tax revenue has not been developed to a level where we can see growth in exponential levels, that the focus is now falling upon corporates, particularly your mining sectors and your more well-established companies in Tanzania, where there is an efficient tax base and where regulation can be changed and implemented at a far quicker pace. I think where Tanzania falls behind perhaps is that the informal sector is not correctly accounted for, particularly in your individual tax collection. Now, the introduction of ID cards, yes, is going to help that that process, but the progress is not going to be made within the next 6 months. It needs 1 to 2 years to be implemented and to run efficiently.
Of course, one of the ways that you get the informal sector into the net is VAT.
Yes.
Which is a tax that you don't have to go out and get once a year or twice a year. You just get it in all the time.
Well, that's definitely something that the government has said that it wants to concentrate on, and they actually want to bring reforms into the way in which VAT is accounted for. There might be an overhaul in terms of the fees and charges related to services, particularly, and we might see more revenue accruing from that. But I still think the focus needs to be on the larger part of the budget. But if we just had to look very briefly outside of revenue, quite a substantial portion of expenditure is still funded by donor aid, official development assistance. And with the fiscal consolidation we're seeing in traditional partners, the government is now starting to align themselves to emerging Asia in order to access that funding. Also, domestic borrowing, much smaller in Tanzania given the level of sophistication of your financial markets. Tanzania, we've seen over the last 2 months, the government, the sovereign, has been quite active in actually trying to tap those international markets for financing. So I think as they expedite the sovereign's rating process and that comes clearer, probably by September, we should see a lot of action coming through in terms of the issuance of Eurobonds, which seems to be the trend in Africa nowadays.
You mentioned donor aid. How do countries like this, which have substantial donor input, how do they budget? Is there one little item somewhere that says donor aid, added to the revenue for the next year? Some of it, of course, is ring-fenced. How do they account for that in the sense of budgeting?
Well, it's usually after the revenue is deducted. So you have your revenue accruing, you see what percentage of that will cover your expenditure, and obviously you would have a shortfall. Now, traditionally, donor aid is made up about 25% of Tanzania's budget. They have projected that it will begin to fall, obviously with the problems that I've mentioned in your more developed countries, your traditional partners. What the funds are allocated towards are specific projects. Now, historically, that has been infrastructure projects, roads, networks particularly, and logistical chains. And the donor will specify if they are involved in a specific project, a long-term project to meet match liabilities and their assets, and they will then have the control over where the funds go to.
Okay, let's look at this. I must say I'd never noticed this before, that all the East African countries are delivering their budgets on the same day. So that's not coincidence. Someone somewhere said, let's do all this together and coordinate it. To what extent do they coordinate their budgets? Because like Southern Africa impacting on each other, that region must impact on each other, and indeed on Southern Africa. So is there an attempt beforehand to align, to let each other know what they're going to be saying, so there are no surprises?
There still is a great degree of independence between your fiscal authorities in East Africa, but let's not forget that they are part of the broader East African community, and there's a concerted effort on the part of the authorities to align certain policies. That's not to say that they will all follow the same type of variables, the same type of policies in the long run. But if we look at how far they've progressed in terms of the same settlement type of units, the affiliations in terms of the trade, if you just look at the structure of your trade partners within East Africa, it's actually moving away from your European and your traditional US partners and more towards regional integration, something which we consider to actually bolster the reputation of a country, because it means access to trading within the region becomes far easier. There has been challenges in the past. We know that in terms of fiscal policy, monetary policy, there needs to be a certain percentage of political will to actually advance the level of integration. For now, within East Africa, it is a trade union, and there is the possibility of progressing towards a monetary union. But as we've well seen in the Eurozone, that comes with its own challenges. And the fact that the policies are so diverse in all these East African countries means that that is quite a way off.
Well, yes, and you've always got, depending on what's happened, someone's unhappy. You know, we're supporting all the others, or we're not getting enough support from all the others in return for our contribution. Tanzania being your speciality, do you travel there a lot? And what is the feeling that you get? And one, I'll tell you why I asked that question. Someone went to Zambia and said there are lots of cranes.
Absolutely.
Around the city. So if there are lots of cranes, there's lots of building, lots of things going on, and maybe indicative of a lot of economic growth coming.
Well, I think that is common to most city centres across Africa for the moment, not least Dar es Salaam. Travel there quite often, and you get a feel for what's happening within the urbanized centers. We've seen massive urbanization take place, particularly over the last 5 years. If you just had to look at some of the forecasts for urbanization, East Africa as a whole, 30% expected urbanization in the next 10 to 20 years. And if you think about where the level of concentration is in terms of your population, 75% of your population in your rural areas migrating into your urban centers. So you are going to see infrastructure builds specifically within your city centres to accommodate that level of urbanization. We've seen quite a number of businesses, not only local businesses, but foreign direct investment, multinationals, starting to set up headquarters within your major city centres. And as Mahmoud said earlier, there is a sense of business confidence, the sense that we are starting to see a strengthening of your economic fundamentals to support a view of opening up shop within Tanzania, because you understand the broader economic benefit over the long run and how it fits into the East African region. There's vast prospect in Tanzania beyond what we're now seeing in this hydrocarbon boom. We still have to look at your traditional sectors of agriculture, tourism, because as I said at the beginning, that is still the lifeblood of your economy, your main employer within the Tanzanian economy.